Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through the next part of the attachment specification, where it asks us to look at Bowlby's monotropic theory. Now, I've mentioned Bowlby several times before, and now we actually get into his theory. And we see that they do ask us to focus on specific parts, the critical period, and we see the internal working model. However, of course, what I'm going to do is go through his entire theory and just make sure we kind of both tick the box for the specification and also understand what Bowlby's theory is. Before we do that, though, it's important for us to kind of recognize that Bowlby really did turn to other theorists first, Lorenz and Harlow. And he really kind of wanted to have a look at the biological components of attachment. So maybe just think back to what are the things that you might have thought about Lorenz and Harlow. They both mentioned the critical period, and they were looking at this kind of idea that attachment or some kind of bond to the mother was innate, was kind of within them. Okay, so if you want to explore that further, just maybe pause the video and kind of think back on the biological components that both Lorenz and Harlow mention. Here we have a picture of Bowlby. It's kind of quite a standard picture of him. He is seen here obviously in his later years. He's a prolific kind of writer on attachment, starting some of his first research back in 1944 when we'll look at a study in the later part of the course. But we see that his attachment theory is published in 1958 and 1969. So therefore, we have to also accept that part of this is coming near the end of what he has had in terms of his career looking at attachment. Now, the only reason I mention this is because when we do look at other aspects of Bowlby, it might be some of his earlier work. So let's get into it. Now, what I've done is I've kind of labeled aspects of his work and given them numbers, and that is arbitrary in that it's not part of the specifications. It's kind of helping me to explain to you kind of where things are. But before we even get there, we see that he has this concept of attachment being an inbuilt mechanism. Okay, so he's often seen as an evolutionary psychologist, saying that attachment has an evolutionary aspect to it, that it's inbuilt, and the reason that we have attachment is this idea that without attachment we wouldn't be able to survive, and that's obviously important to him. So he looks at kind of your Harlow and your Lorenz and seeing kind of how the babies are dependent on the mother for survival, and it's not just food, it's kind of they need the mother for more than just food. And as such, if we're going to talk through evolution, we've got to use this word adaptive, and so we say pretty much that attachment adapts to the thing that it needs in order for it says here, they will increase the likelihood of survival. And so he often refers to something called social releases. Now, of course, if you go back to your caregiver-infant interaction part of the course, you kind of know that this may well be part of it. And so we know that babies can cry. That's their form of communication. They can look around. They can smile. All of this is done in terms of a social release in order to maintain parental interest. Because as soon as the parent stops being interested in the baby's not going to survive. Okay, so this is kind of the prelude to Bowlby's understanding of attachment. He believes that it's part of our kind of innate ability to survive. Now, the key is that it's not just the babies that are innately programmed to do those things that they need in order for the child to be to survive. We see that adults also are innately programmed. Now, if you haven't had much experience of babies, you perhaps should try and observe either young parents or people who are pregnant and people who have young babies, and it's one of the things that kind of break some of the social barriers in terms of I've got into a lift with a baby and people talk to me. Otherwise, they wouldn't talk to me. It's because I have this baby, because the baby kind of draws them to this, and they kind of want to interact with the babies. And so the things that we typically do when we see a baby is we try and cuddle them, we smile at them, we kind of make funny noises, we speak in a higher voice, we do all these things that are pretty much, and Bowlby would say it's innately programmed within us. And so therefore we see that attachment is this two-way process. It's not just the babies needing us for survival. We kind of also kind of have this bond with the babies in order to kind of rear our offspring. So the first key point that we need to look at. So all of that stuff is important. Think about kind of where you would place that if you're writing about knowledge. It's not, it is important, but of course we've got to kind of decide kind of what knowledge is important to the examiner, and the specification is named monotropy as being one of the things that we need to talk about. Now, of course, it says here that he describes his theory as monotropic. Okay, mono being single, being one. Tropic is kind of part of that whole kind of chemistry, that's entropy between one place to the other. And so it says it's monotropic because he places one particular caregiver in the center of the child's attachment. Okay, and of course he says that this child's attachment is going to be more important than any of the other attachments. And now this is really a key feature of Bowlby, because he is saying that the mother is at the pinnacle of a hierarchy. Okay, so there's this idea that the mother is on top. Now, of course, he is willing to acknowledge that mother doesn't have to be the biological mother. It can be somebody else who's a primary attachment figure. But there's still one that's more important than the others. And that's the key to monotropy. He says that the child will form a number of attachments to other people. So he's not anti-multiple attachments, but he does feel that there is a clear need for that primary attachment figure to be more important than the others. Okay, so but it was clear that the biological mother is going to be obviously one of the first people it can attach to, but of course if there's other people out there, the primary attachment figure is quite important. So then, adding to monotropy and kind of the importance of it, that Bowlby said, okay, so if that primary attachment figure has that pinnacle, that hierarchy of importance, that the more time we spend with that primary attachment figure, the better. Okay, so the more time, the better. And in fact, this is potentially where we can either draw some criticisms of Bowlby, or we could potentially consider kind of, okay, so what are the implications of this? So if you are a mother that wants to return to work, this could well have implications of that, because he's actually saying that the more time, the better. In fact, he goes on to clarify this in principles. Now, I personally don't feel that too much detail on this is necessary, but of course it helps us understand monotropy. Okay, so first of all, he adds this idea and he calls it the law of continuity. So basically, babies, he said, need to have this constant and predictable care. Okay, so of course, if I'm always swapping around, if the child is having kind of multiple people caring for it repeatedly, this may well actually be a slight problem. So in terms of building the monotropic relationship, it needs to be continuous, it needs to be constant and predictable, and if it is, it has better quality attachment. So in other words, we're kind of saying that if the mother stays at home, looks after the baby, it's going to have a better quality attachment. Now, of course, I am not in favor of promoting this too much, because obviously society has changed, and we also kind of, it both puts pressures on mothers who believe that maybe they're not good mothers if they aren't the primary caregiver, and also it kind of downplays the role of father and kind of other kind of single parents and things like that who need to work. However, of course, monotropy does say, first of all, that it's more important and we need to have this constant care. The second aspect that he talks about, it says the law of accumulated separation. So basically, he is concerned that the more you're separated from your primary caregiver, the more kind of problem it is, or kind of damaging it could be. And he does kind of state this as kind of quite strong. It says that every separation from the mother is problematic, and it said that the safest dose, he says here, is therefore 0. So in other words, if the child is never separated from the mother, then that's ideal. Okay, so there we have monotropy. You can see it's quite a strong kind of way of kind of talking about parenting, talking about kind of primary attachment figures, and certainly a big part of Bowlby's theory. The next part that we need to look at in terms of kind of what we're confirming from both Lorenz and Harlow is this idea of critical period. So he kind of borrows directly from them and develops his understanding of it. So it says that the interplay between the infant and adult attachment system gradually builds. Okay, so he is quite ironically also about sensitivity, kind of saying that interplay is a kind of about recognizing what the child needs. But then he goes on to say this, that there is a critical period around 2 years. Okay, and then it's in these 2 years that the system is active. So for him, the critical period is kind of, it's obviously critical. He's kind of talking about this idea, this need for it. That's what critical means. But he's kind of saying that there's a 2-year period in which the attachment bond, and it says here, the attachment system is active. Now, if you read a lot of Bowlby and perhaps flip between different textbooks, between different kind of publications, you'll see that Bowlby is kind of one of his own kind of critics at times, kind of saying different times and different things. Okay, so there's a couple of things that we need to do to kind of maybe narrow it down to simplify it. So this 2-year period, I think, is a fair enough kind of understanding of it. He does kind of say that actually in the first 12 months or so, that the child becomes kind of even more open to attachment. And so when people criticized some of the ways that he spoke about this, he kind of also refers to the sensitive period within the critical period, and saying that that becomes quite important. So it says here, the child is maximally sensitive at the age of 2, but if an attachment is not formed at this time, the child will find it harder to form one later. So he is kind of calming down his critical period type of understanding, but he is still very clear that what's really important, that if you don't form that attachment within that sensitive period, that there's a problem. And so then one of the key kind of placeholders we sometimes put on this is this 2.5 years. And Bowlby basically said that if you don't form an attachment in those first 2.5 years, you won't be able to form one. So then the final aspect that he does talk about in terms of his model is this internal working model. And I know in the other parts of the course you've looked at schemas, you've understood how potentially we have these mental representations that do kind of help us understand or interpret the world as we know it. Okay, and so Bowlby said that the child forms a mental representation of relationships with their primary caregiver. So another way that we can view this is that, okay, it's a schema, it's a mental representation. It's like a model for future relationships based on the primary caregiver. Okay, so that's really important here. So it's internal working model. So in other words, as the attachment bond forms between the infant and the caregiver, and vice versa, the infant forms this kind of internal model of kind of what a relationship with somebody else looks like, and Bowlby calls that internal working model. Okay, and he says this model says it serves for a model for what relationships are like. Okay, so in other words, it's kind of like the baseline. This is what relationships are like. So therefore, this becomes the important aspect that Bowlby talks about, because it said it could affect our future relationships. Okay, so if that initial attachment is faulty, obviously that's going to be a problem. But he, of course, is not open necessarily to this idea that it will be faulty, because he says this is primary attachment figure, especially if you follow kind of this whole idea of continuity, that you never separated from the primary caregiver. It's going to be a positive future relationship. So the example could be this, that if your first experience is loving, then of course you are going to form the same type of expectations that all relationships are loving. Okay, so in other words, it's kind of like a template as well. That's another way you could describe this, that your initial attachment bond with your primary caregiver it forms this template for future relationships, and that becomes important to us. We do find, however, that this is understood later by other theorists as well, to say, well, actually, if there's a poor treatment of the child, then of course their template is going to be damaged in some ways. And this is possibly the hardest part of the course, because some of you might be questioning kind of your template, so to speak, your internal working model, because of your own personal experiences. And we do explore this later within the topic in terms of kind of the impact of your internal working model on future relationships. And the truth of it is that obviously there's something to this in terms of what Bowlby is saying. But I also believe that there's ways of kind of knowing about your internal working model, knowing about kind of what it is that kind of makes you who you are, that could potentially change some of those things. We do need to be able to talk about the internal working model in terms of the child's, it says here, the later ability to parent themselves as well, because Bowlby is telling us that this first initial attachment to primary caregiver is important, and of course we have already seen this from Harlow, potentially, that if you were badly parented, you go on to become bad parents yourselves. Okay, and so it's kind of easy to kind of look at the negative, but obviously Bowlby is kind of talking about the positive here as well, and kind of saying that if you do come from a functional family, you tend to have kind of similar kind of families themselves. And so therefore we can say that at this particular stage that it's important for you to kind of recognize that if you are somebody who comes from a functional family, perhaps you don't understand what it's like to kind of like to be in a different situation. And possibly if you come from a dysfunctional family, it's often why, if you potentially have friends or partners or people that you care about that have that kind of functional family kind of situation, that there's something quite nice to that, kind of something quite familiar to that, and perhaps something that you might notice automatically. So there we have it. We have the concepts that Bowlby wanted us to know about in terms of his attachment model, and which he writes about in his writings. Now, of course, not everyone is positive about Bowlby, and I do appreciate this video is a little bit longer, but of course you can kind of split it in two parts and look at the evaluation as one, and the theory, the content in the other. So the first thing we can talk about is, of course, that he overstates this monotropy. Okay, besides the obvious things that it kind of puts pressure on women, it kind of has this clear focus on mother. We're going to have some issues there, and of course, fortunately for us, there's actually other people that we've already heard about that potentially are going to be critical of this kind of monotropy as well. So we see Rutter, he kind of talks about multiple attachments, and he's saying that this is more common, and that babies aren't cared for in a vacuum. They don't just have mother. Now, of course, this could be different for your kind of personal circumstances. You might have a single carer, However, many people, even in a single kind of parent kind of household, will have other people that interact with the baby in a meaningful way, from childminders to grandparents to siblings. And so Rutter does believe that multiple attachments are more common. And of course, what we need to recognize is that this is a complete contrast to Bowlby, because it's saying that there's no primary and secondary attachments in terms of importance. Okay, so every attachment is important. Okay, and that's kind of what Rutter is telling us. We see Grossmann and Grossmann, and we all learn about Grossmann and Grossmann in the cross-cultural kind of variations that we have a look at. Kind of said, well, what about the role of the fathers? That's important in terms of social development. We see that that the fathers become important. We also know that peers and siblings become important in terms of things like negotiation, learning kind of how to play nicely with others. But of course, not everyone is completely kind of against Bowlby's monotropy. Pryor and Glasser basically kind of are concerned that there is evidence of some kind of hierarchy. And as a parent myself, as somebody who's taught attachment for a number of years, I wish I kind of had a very clear kind of pivotal understanding of kind of whether it's monotropic or multiple. If I look at my own children, there's certainly aspects of it where I kind of can appreciate monotropy and appreciate that kind of one special bond, but also at the same time I can see how multiple attachments, important attachments they are. So, I wish I had a clear understanding myself. So it's one of those things in terms of the evaluation that you kind of need to just be open to this discussion, that some people believe it's monotropic and some people believe it's not. However, when we do tend to look at Bowlby, I always introduce a kind of an alternative explanation, because at this particular moment, Bowlby does kind of have a very kind of strong foothold in our attachment theory, in our understanding of kind of how we form attachments, and certainly he opens up this idea that we need to be sensitive to our children, because it's innate, adapted. These social releases that we have kind of draw us to the child, and we kind of end up kind of like understanding and reading kind of what are their needs. Okay, so they have social releases, we kind of feed off them and things like that. But not everyone kind of believes that this is actually the case. And the kind of the most famous person who kind of challenges this is this person called Kagan, and he comes up with this temperamental hypothesis. Okay, he talks about how it's not so much this innate ability for the child to kind of build their attachment relationship in us and us to respond to them. He says that, well, actually some children just have different temperaments, and it's these temperaments that shape how we respond to the child. And our temperament is kind of that, so it is still innate, but it's kind of who we are. And I think back on the people that there's some people that are clearly easy to get along with, and some people that are not so easy to get along with. And can you imagine that kind of them as a baby? So if they're easy to get along with, then maybe that attachment bond kind of might be down to that easy to get along with. If they're difficult to get along with, maybe that's kind of shapes their attachment as well. And so he says innate, trusting and friendly personalities can actually be what secure attachment is about. So it's actually the temperament of the child that comes that builds the secure attachment, and that if they have a different temperament that's not friendly or trusting, then they don't have a secure attachment. Okay, and in order to kind of back this up, that Kagan is saying, well, actually it's down to the temperament, Thomas and Chess actually said there are different types of personalities. So in other words, these infants do actually have personality types. So some infants are easy, some infants are difficult, and some infants are slow to warm up. So in other words, the child is not forming this attachment bond based on the sensitivity of the parent and this innate ability for the two to kind of respond to social releases. It's actually because of the personality. Now that is a real issue, okay? Because this hypothesis is basically saying that there's some other reason why we have this attachment bond formed, and it's saying that the attachment is formed because of their of their temperament and not because of the sensitivity. So it seems that this is important for us to kind of pay attention to. Now, of course, obviously, we are learning about Bowlby's theory. So clearly, Bowlby becomes prominent, and people kind of buy into kind of what he does. And we're not learning about Kagan as the primary kind of understanding of attachment. So therefore, this is just a criticism. It's of Bowlby's work to say, well, actually, other people have thought about attachment, and this is kind of what they've said. Belsky and Ravine basically would support Kagan in some ways and say, actually, if a child has behavioural instability as a newborn, then that can actually predict insecure attachment. So in other words, when we look at children and kind of see how they kind of are as babies, that could predict their attachments later on as well. However, having introduced that kind of criticism, perhaps we need to come back into the research support. There are people who kind of do look at research support and say that actually there's something about Bowlby's continuity, this idea that actually maybe we do need to have the attachment bond. And one of the big kind of players in this is this research group led by Schroff, who basically said that it says that securely attached infants are more likely to have high levels of social competence, were less isolated, more popular, and more empathetic as adolescents. Now, this is really important to us, okay? So they've done a 1-year study, okay? So a long-term study from 1 year to adolescence. So this is a long-term looking at these particular children, and they're saying if you're securely attached, you have all these amazing things, okay? Social competence, you feel less isolated, you're more popular, or more empathetic and things like that. And it's down to the secure attachment. Okay, so a lot of people do kind of work on this. There is this kind of belief that we do need to kind of look at early childhood attachment and make sure that secure attachment is there, and that children will have a much better future if they do, partly thanks to the work of Schroff. Now, just giving you details about Schroff's research, they were rated by teachers and counsellors, they were observed, they had all these different things. So it could be that ultimately, if they do have this attachment bond, so in other words, if there is this continuity of the bond, then that's quite important to these particular children. We also know that this is kind of supported by some research by Hazan and Shaver, and they do quite an important, or quite a kind of novel study called the Love Quiz, in which they kind of publish some work in a magazine where people kind of respond to it, and they respond to the quiz that Hazan and Shaver put in this particular kind of magazine, and they are able to designate that some people are securely attached and other people are insecurely attached. And what we find is that those people that they are able to designate as being securely attached saw love as durable and supportive. So in other words, there's a much positive view on love if you are securely attached. However, if you're insecurely attached, it says here that love is rare and fragile. So in other words, it is kind of, I will go into much more detail with Hazan and Shaver in the later part of the course, but we kind of see that there is this kind of research that says, you know what, attachment, secure attachment, does kind of give you a much more positive outcome in terms of romantic relationships and love as well. We find that in terms of trying to understand Bowlby's kind of look at the primary caregiver, and it says that strongly attached infants had mothers who responded quickly. So it seems that we're never going to be able to move away from Bowlby's kind of understanding that actually if you are able to respond to those social releases and kind of have that good attachment bonds are the ones, you're going to have strong attachment with your children. So we see that sensitivity becomes an important part of Bowlby's theory, and we do understand, of course, that there's quite a lot of research that supports that sensitivity to the child's needs are important, and even if Schaffer and Emerson would agree with this aspect of Bowlby's kind of work as well. So we also know that, just to kind of close this idea up, that Harlow was also kind of saying that that you need to have this interaction with a caring adult, because as you become maladjusted, if you don't have it. So we do kind of have quite a lot of evidence to kind of support this idea that maybe there's the importance of kind of sensitivity to a adult, of an adult. Now, just to kind of finish with, I know this is a longer video than we normally have. There's a couple of questions out there. This question came from an old paper, that's why it's a 12-mark essay rather than a 16-mark essay. But we see that they kind of they tell you that they want you to write an essay on learning theory and Bowlby's theory. So we just feel that those are the important theories of attachment. And then it says outline and evaluate one or more explanations of attachment. So for you, you need to kind of focus on those two theories: learning theory, Bowlby's theory. I also quite like this question. I know some of it is obscured, but we see here that this is just an applied question where they basically talk about two different experiences. One is kind of saying feeling sorry for their husband because they aren't able to bond because of breastfeeding. So that's obviously learning theory. The other one says, no, there's something more to it. So we think that, you know, that gives you enough kind of idea to kind of contrast learning theory with Bowlby. And then, of course, the question looks like this: discuss the learning theory of attachment and Bowlby's monotropic theory of attachment. So in other words, it's asking us to discuss. So it's kind of saying we need to have knowledge that kind of talks about the two theories, and potentially you could even look at the contrast of the two based on what the two people are saying about attachment. And for 16 marker, a really good question that came from June 2018, and of course that means that it's part of the new specification for us. So there we have it. We've gone through Bowlby's theory. It's quite a lot more detailed than learning theory. It's possibly more commonly accepted as a better understanding of attachment, and therefore I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I'll continue the course at a later stage. Hope you're well, stay safe, and bye-bye.